There are things a man does in war that he spends the rest of his life trying to explain to himself, not to other people. Other people don't have the vocabulary for it. I've tried. Twice with a therapist in the 90s who kept nodding in a way that told me he was hearing words but not weight. Once with my son, who looked at me across a dinner table with eyes that went somewhere far away, and then came back and changed the subject. You learn quickly that some experiences don't translate. They exist in their own sealed room inside you, and the door only opens at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet, and the darkness has a particular quality that takes you back. I'm 70 years old. I have grandchildren who call me Papa Ray. I coach Little League in the spring because the boys remind me that the world keeps producing people who haven't been broken yet. And something in that is necessary to me. I have a garden. I grow tomatoes that my wife says are the best she's ever eaten. And I believe her. And I tend them with a care that probably looks excessive from the outside. I also have something in my chest that never fully dissolved. A thing that sits there, quiet and heavy and patient, like a stone at the bottom of a cold river. Most days I barely feel it. And then something will happen. A particular quality of light in late afternoon, or the distant sound of a car backfiring, or just a random Tuesday in October when the air smells a certain way, and it comes back with full weight. This is the story of how it got there. Vietnam, 1972. I was 22 years old, and I believed, with the complete confidence that only the very young and the very foolish can sustain, that I was indestructible. I'd been in country for 5 months by then, long enough to have lost the first layer of innocence, long enough to know what the jungle smelled like after contact, that specific combination of cordite and vegetation and copper that gets coded into your nervous system at a cellular level and never leaves, long enough to have held men while they died, and filed that experience somewhere deep and carried on, because carrying on was the only available option. Our squad had 8 men. I need you to understand who these men were before I tell you what happened to them. Because this story isn't about an abstraction. It isn't about soldiers or casualties or any of the other clinical language that gets used to sand the edges off reality. It's about specific human beings with specific lives and specific people at home who were waiting for them. Tommy Beaumont was from Mobile, Alabama, 20 years old. He had a laugh that started somewhere in his chest and came out bigger than seemed physically possible from a man his size. He was planning to study agricultural science when he got home. He wanted to understand soil. He used to say that the ground was where everything started and everything ended, and most people never looked at it properly. He looked at the ground all the time, everywhere we went, with this quiet professional curiosity that I found fascinating in a man who wasn't yet old enough to drink. Corporal James Whitfield, we called him Whit, was from Detroit, 25. Had a wife named Sandra and a son named Marcus who was 2 years old and whose photograph Whit kept in a waterproof sleeve against his chest. He talked about Marcus the way Danny Kowalski talked about Maisie, years and a different war later. Like the kid was a compass, like everything oriented around him. Whit was going to take over his uncle's auto repair shop. He had a plan. He always had a plan. Sergeant Dale Prescott was 41, which made him ancient by the standards of that particular war in that particular jungle. He'd served in Korea. He'd come back and tried civilian life for 6 years and found it insufficient. In some way he was never fully able to articulate. He was the kind of man who was most himself in conditions of difficulty, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because difficulty organized him, gave him a shape. He was calm in the way that deep water is calm, not still exactly, but possessed of an enormous weight that kept surface disturbances from meaning anything. Prescott was the one who made me take the oath. It happened 3 weeks before everything. We were in a holding position waiting for extraction after a patrol that had gone longer than planned, sitting in the kind of bored, exhausted half-vigilance that defines so many hours of military service. And Prescott was cleaning his rifle with that methodical patience he brought to everything. And he said, without looking up, "Beaumont, Whitfield, Ray, come here." We gathered. He still didn't look up. He said, "I want you 3 to make a promise to me, and I want it to be the kind of promise a man keeps even when keeping it costs him something real." We waited. He said, "Whatever happens out there, whatever you find, whatever you come across, whatever is still breathing when the shooting stops, you treat it. You understand? A medic treats. That's the whole job, the whole purpose. The moment you start deciding who deserves treatment, you're not a medic anymore. You're something else. And I don't want something else in my squad." I remember looking at Tommy. Tommy was looking at Prescott with an expression somewhere between respect and discomfort. The kind of expression that appears on a young man's face when something is being asked of him that he senses is larger than he's yet had to be. We made the promise, all 3 of us. Quietly, without ceremony, the way men make promises to each other in the field, as if the understatement is itself a form of seriousness. 3 weeks later, Prescott was dead, and the thing that killed him was waiting for me in the jungle. The morning of the ambush had a quality I should have read more carefully. There was a stillness that wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. We were on a search and clear operation. Moving through dense secondary growth about 12 clicks from our fire base, following a trail that intelligence suggested was being used for resupply. 8 men. Prescott on point with Rodriguez, then Beaumont and Hayes behind them, then Witt and Chen, then me and Private Cooper bringing up the rear. The trail curved right around a large kapok tree, and the world detonated. The first shot came from high ground to the left. Prescott dropped without making a sound. 1 shot, and he was simply no longer standing. The body takes a moment to accept these things. The mind fights it. I saw him fall, and some part of my brain said, "No, he slipped. He's going down for cover." And another part of my brain that dealt in reality understood immediately, and that understanding was a physical sensation, cold and absolute, spreading from my chest outward. Then the second shot, Tommy Beaumont. He was turning to look at where Prescott had fallen when the round took him in the throat. He went down differently. Not the clean drop of an instantly neutralized nervous system, but a crumpling, a slow, terrible collapse. And I heard the sound he made, and I am not going to describe that sound, and I am not going to forget it. The rest of the squad opened up, every direction. The jungle became noise and smoke, and the shrieking of birds flushed from the canopy. Rodriguez was hit in the arm. Hayes went down with a leg wound. Witt was returning fire toward the high ground. Controlled, accurate, exactly what Prescott had trained him to do. I was moving before I had made any decision to move. Tommy first. Because Tommy was making sounds. Because where there is sound, there is still something to fight for. I reached him in 10 seconds that felt like a separate lifetime. The wound was catastrophic, throat and upper chest. The kind of wound that a field medic looks at and performs an immediate, brutal arithmetic and arrives at an answer that has nothing to do with hope. I worked anyway. You work anyway. That's what you do. You work until the working is clearly over, and even then you stay. He grabbed my arm. His eyes were on me. I talked to him. I told him about the soil. I said I was going to read about soil science when we got back. I said he'd have to help me understand it. I said we'd look at soil together as many times as he wanted. He was gone inside 3 minutes. I will not tell you what those 3 minutes felt like. I don't have the language, and I've looked for it. It isn't there. The firing had moved. What had been a coordinated ambush was becoming a withdrawal. The squad, reduced and shaken and furious, was consolidating, treating the wounded, calling for extraction. Witt was running the situation with the cold competence that grief sometimes produces in excellent soldiers, channeling everything into the immediate requirement of keeping the living alive. Prescott, Tommy, gone. The extraction was called, 20 minutes out, and then Witt heard something in the jungle. Movement. 30 meters northwest of our position, back up toward the high ground where the shots had come from. He held up a fist, and we all went still and listened, and there it was. Something or someone moving through vegetation with a speed that suggested controlled retreat rather than random animal movement. The sniper, still in the area. Witt looked at me. I looked at him. We both knew what the others were thinking. We could hear it in the quality of the silence. Rodriguez said quietly and without particular heat, the way a man states an obvious fact. Let whatever it is bleed out. Nobody disagreed with that. Nobody had to. I found him 40 meters from where Prescott fell. I wasn't supposed to go. I went anyway, alone, moving fast and low because something, I don't know what to call it, not heroism, not even duty exactly. Something more like the programming of a promise made 3 weeks earlier to a man who was now dead, activating in me without my full conscious cooperation. He was propped against the buttressed root of a large tree, partially concealed by undergrowth, and he was attempting with enormous determination and failing hands to apply pressure to a wound in his left side. A through and through of the lower torso. He was losing blood at a rate that even his obvious discipline and will could not compensate for indefinitely. He was maybe 19 years old. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 19. The age of a college sophomore. The age of a boy, which is what he was. A boy with a rifle and a mission and a cause that was not my cause. Lying in the dirt of a jungle that was not his jungle either, trying very hard not to die. He heard me coming. His rifle was not in reach. He'd managed to field strip part of it in an attempt to disable it, which told me something about his training and his ethics that landed with complicated weight. He looked at me with an expression that I have never been able to fully categorize. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like a man who has run his calculations and arrived at the answer and is now waiting to see if the answer is correct. He thought I was there to kill him. I put my medical bag on the ground in front of him. I opened it slowly. I held up my hands. In that jungle, in that moment, with Tommy Beaumont's blood still on my fatigues and Dale Prescott fallen back there in the vegetation, I want to be honest with you about what was in my chest. There was grief. There was rage. There was something I am not proud of. Something that understood perfectly well what Rodriguez had meant, that agreed with it, that wanted to stand up and walk back and let the arithmetic take its natural course. And underneath all of that, Prescott's voice, quiet and methodical as he cleaned his rifle. The moment you start deciding who deserves treatment, you're not a medic anymore. I knelt down in the dirt beside the man who had killed my brothers, and I opened my bag, and I went to work. I need you to understand what field surgery on a gunshot wound to the lower torso actually involves when your operating theater is the jungle floor, and your anesthesia is a half-empty morphine syringe, and your light is whatever the canopy allows through. And your instruments are whatever your hands and your training and your kit can provide. It involves intimacy of a kind that peacetime medicine almost never demands. You are inside someone's body with your hands. You are navigating by feel through tissue and fluid, searching for the source of the bleeding, working to control it, working to clean what can be cleaned and pack what must be packed, all while the patient's nervous system is doing everything it can to shut the whole operation down. He didn't make it easy. Not out of hostility. I want to be careful about that. He endured it. He was disciplined in his endurance in the way that I came to understand meant he'd been trained to accept pain without sound, without complaint, because sound carried in the jungle, and complaint was a luxury that his circumstances had not permitted. He lay there and he shook and he sweated and he breathed in a controlled way that I recognized as an act of tremendous will, and he did not make a sound. I talked to him. I don't know why. He didn't speak English, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. I didn't speak Vietnamese beyond the operational minimum. But I talked anyway, the same way I'd talked to Tommy in those final minutes, as if the voice itself was a form of medicine, as if the sound of another human being treating this thing as a conversation rather than a transaction carried some physiological value. I told him about Prescott. I don't know why I did that either. I told him that the man he'd likely killed today was a good man. A complicated good man who had survived Korea and found that peace didn't fit him, and had come back to war not out of bloodlust, but out of some need for structure that civilian life denied him. I said I didn't hold that against him, Prescott, or against him, the boy in the dirt. That the whole situation was a construction that had very little to do with either of them as individuals. That they were both instruments of arguments being made by men in rooms very far from this jungle. I don't know if that's true. I was 22 and frightened and doing something that was costing me more than I had a clear account of yet. He watched me while I worked. After the first few minutes, the hostility or wariness or whatever had been in his eyes settled into something else. something I can only describe as paying attention, like he was studying me, like he was trying to understand what kind of creature would do this. I have asked myself that question many times since. The extraction team found me 40 minutes later, still with him, still working. The wound was stabilized, not healed. There's no healing in the field. There is only stabilization, and the prayer that stabilization holds long enough to get someone to the next level of care. But stabilized. His blood pressure had come back from the floor. His color was marginally better. He was conscious and watching. The look on the extraction team's faces when they found me, I won't detail that either. I'll say that Sergeant Kowalski, who was leading that particular team, was a professional, and that his professionalism held, and that he made the decisions that the situation required without commentary that I would have found difficult to withstand in that moment. We brought him back. The logistics of that, the conversations that happened over my head while I sat in a corner of the medevac and kept my hand on his pulse because his pulse was the one thing I could still control. The forms, the protocols, the intervention of people with more rank than me and less proximity to what had actually happened out there. He went into surgery. I sat outside surgery on a metal chair and stared at a wall. Whit found me there 2 hours later. He sat down beside me and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Prescott would have done the same." I said, "I know." He said, "That doesn't make it easier." I said, "No, it doesn't." We sat there together until the surgeon came out, and the surgeon said the patient was going to live. And Whit put his hand on my shoulder and kept it there for a moment, and then stood up and walked away. And I sat back down on the metal chair and cried for the first time since Tommy Beaumont died. Not quietly, not with any dignity. The ugly kind of crying that comes from somewhere below the decisions you make about yourself. The young man, I never knew his name. I asked later through channels, and what came back was either incomplete or deliberately obscured, and I eventually accepted that it was going to remain a blank. He recovered. He was processed according to the protocols that existed for such situations. I assume he eventually went home. I assume there were people who were glad he did. I have a photograph from that day, not of him, of me sitting outside that surgery, taken by someone without my knowledge or permission. I look like a man who has been turned inside out and put back together by someone who wasn't entirely sure how the pieces fit. Someone sent it to me years later with a note that just said, "I was there. I never forgot. You did the right thing." I don't know if I did. I have thought about it for 50 years and I still don't know. What I know is what I did, and what I know is why I did it. And what I know is that the weight of it, the specific compound weight of that day, all of it, Tommy and Prescott and the 19-year-old boy and the oath and the grief and the choice, has lived in my chest since 1972, like a stone at the bottom of a cold river. Most days I barely feel it. And then sometimes I'm in the garden, tending the tomatoes, hands in the soil, and I think about Tommy Beaumont wanting to understand the ground. And I feel every ounce. My granddaughter asked me once, she's 14, sharp as a blade, nothing gets past her. She asked me what I did in the war, the way kids ask, direct, without the protective softening that adults layer over difficult questions. I told her I was a medic. I told her my job was to keep people alive. She said, "Did you?" I said, "Some of them." She thought about that and then she said, "Is that enough?" I've been thinking about that question ever since. It was asked 3 years ago and I think about it most days. I don't have an answer that satisfies. What I have is this. I made a promise to a man who understood that the alternative to that promise was a kind of moral death that the body could survive but the self could not. I kept the promise in the hardest possible circumstances. I kept it when the grief was so fresh it had a physical temperature. I kept it when no one would have blamed me for not keeping it. When not keeping it would have been, in the eyes of most people present, not a failure, but a justice. And I am still here, 50 years later, still asking whether I did right. That unresolved quality, that permanent incompleteness. I've come to believe that might be exactly what a moral act feels like from the inside. Not the clean satisfaction of a good deed acknowledged and archived. Not the warmth of approval. Not resolution. Just the weight. Just the carrying. Just the getting up each morning and tending what needs tending and holding what needs to be held and not knowing, never quite knowing, whether the scales balance. Prescott told us that the moment you start deciding who deserves treatment, you're not a medic anymore. He was right. I believe that. I also buried 2 brothers the same day I saved the man who put them in the ground. And there is no philosophy in the world elegant enough to make that uncomplicated. 50 years. A garden. Grandchildren. Tomatoes that my wife says are the best she's ever eaten. And a stone at the bottom of a cold river. That's the truth of it. All of it. Every part. You can decide what it means. I can't.